Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Monday. As you're aware, throughout the month of September, I've been focusing on the goddess Modron on Mondays, and today is no exception. You'll notice from the title, Goddess Modron Motherhood Interrupted, you can tell that we're going to be wading into some emotionally sensitive territory today. And I really debated about whether or not sharing this. However, just in case anyone thinks that I have no right to speak on this subject, because that's something that people like to throw out, saying you couldn't possibly understand what something feels like, I would like to make it very clear that I do. Motherhood could be interrupted in several different ways. Certainly, if a mother has the tragedy of losing her child to death, that can happen. Sometimes people struggle terribly with infertility issues, and they are not able to have children of their own, and they might seek to go through the adoption process, which is a beautiful thing to do, to open up your home and your heart to a child that's not of your blood. But it is a complicated process, and there's a lot of false starts and a lot of stops. I've heard some experiences over the years from people who opened up and said just how heart-wrenching the process was, how glad they were when things finally worked out, but it was very difficult. Some people go through various medical procedures trying to conceive, and sometimes those procedures aren't always successful, and that can be very hard on people. Some women end up getting abortions, and then after the fact, they are just filled with remorse. I know not everyone has that experience, but some do, and that is one of the actions in life that if you take it, there's no undoing it. You can't take that back. So if someone does find themselves in that situation, that can be psychologically extremely difficult. Another interruption of motherhood, which I have personal experience with, is in miscarriages. And I have to say, I don't think it matters whether or not you just found out the pregnancy and as soon as you found out about it, you lost the baby, or if it happened further on down the line, or if it was a stillborn. The moment you're aware of your child, I don't think you can hardly help from feeling that love for them and that sense of protectiveness and a willingness to do whatever it takes to see to their welfare, and to lose them when there's nothing you could do. That's going to be difficult no matter what stage the pregnancy was in. I myself had 3 in my early 20s. One was a singleton. The second time was a set of twins. They would have been 18 and 17 by now. Think about them. I think most women who've lost children that way have. And it's even worse is because when they die before they're born, is that it's very difficult for people to offer you the comfort and the support that you really need in order to work through all of those emotions. People don't know what to say. People don't know how to react. It's such an intensely personal thing, and if you're empathic, experiencing the sensation of your children dying inside of you, that's not something I would wish on my worst enemy. I don't know how to put that experience into words, only just how horrific it was. And that's something you learn to live with. I'm not sure that's something that you ever really... I don't want to say that you don't recover from it, because being able to go on and live life, that is certainly recovery. But it is something that does stay with you, and it does shape your character. I'm certainly not the same person now as I was before that happened. Now, the reason why I bring up the goddess Modron in this context is because she, too, had her own motherhood interrupted because her child was abducted. And sadly, a lot of families today, they have to deal with the absolute hell and torture of losing a child to them in that fashion. Sometimes the children are recovered and things are all right, and sometimes that's not how it works out. And it's a horrible, awful thing. And obviously, this is emotionally difficult territory. I don't even have notes with me today. I'm just speaking off the cuff. And because I couldn't write down the notes, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, it's even for me, when I try to put things in a logically cohesive fashion, there are times when the heart does tend to overwhelm one. And that's one of these times. But in moments of such tragedy, if we can't lean onto our spirituality, then it raises the question of, do our spiritual beliefs have any validity? Because one thing that spirituality is very much for is having an anchor in your life and something to cling to when the worst things you could imagine happening happen. And I think there are a few things that are worse than losing a child, no matter how that loss took place. The goddess Modron is someone who understands that pain. In the mythos, we can see that for the period of time when she was separated from her child Mabon, it had a detrimental effect on the land. There were side effects. And of course, anyone who has lost their child in some way, of course, you understand why that kind of devastation would be a natural outcome of that situation. You're not going to look at the world in the same way. You're not going to be able to interact with people in the same way. You're not going to see the order of priorities in the same way that other people do. You can't help any of that. You've been dealt a blow that most people have trouble surviving. Marriages end when there's a loss of a child because you don't always know how to knit yourselves back together after that. At the time when you need each other the most, sometimes, for whatever reason, people aren't able to do it. It has long-term consequences. It's the kind of tragedy that tends to compound other tragedies on top of it. However, anyone who is in that situation, if you can possibly take this moment and make yourself closer to your spouse or your partner, whoever it is, who the other parent is, and tread those waters together, I would certainly recommend it because you need all the support you can get, even if it's something as horrific and as difficult to talk about as this. Another thing I'd also like to stress is that there is a need to lean into our spiritual beliefs and to lean on our gods in such moments. When I lost my kids, I was a Jehovah's Witness at the time. Now, one of the things that the Jehovah's Witness Church teaches is that if someone dies, that after Armageddon and the smoke is cleared, that God is going to resurrect your dead loved ones, and you'll be able to see them again. However, the church also teaches that in the case of miscarried babies or someone who hadn't drawn the breath of life, as they would describe it, that they wouldn't be resurrected. So even in that belief system, when I really needed support and needed comfort and needed some way to process things and needed some hope, that even though this awful thing had happened, it wasn't necessarily the end of everything. In that moment, that religion truly failed me. And it sent me off into this tailspin because Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, are, they don't countenance abortion under any circumstances. And I thought, how could that possibly be logically consistent? If you acknowledge that womb, that life within the womb is a life, then why wouldn't you teach that if that life is lost, that it can come back, that it can be resurrected, and that the parents could go through the pregnancy normally, or that God would make some kind of other arrangements. They didn't have any explanations, and what I was told made no sense to me, even on their own terms. And it's one of those things that began planting seeds of doubt in me about whether or not that religion had any business claiming to be the one true religion, and if it had any benefits to the people within that religion at all. So I think it's important because obviously people in the pagan community and witches and so on, We're not immune from these horrible tragedies of life. The witches have miscarriages. Witches have abortions that they later regretted. Witches have infertility issues. Even though we do have some pretty badass spells to help with pregnancy, sometimes it's not enough. I wish it was, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes people have issues going through the adoption process. Sometimes people have children and their children are taken from them for some reason. We are not immune to these tragedies of life, and when they occur, we need something out of our spirituality. We need something to sustain us. And certainly if we have access to pagan community of any kind, we definitely need to be able to have relationships within that. And you can't have relationships within community unless you've been communicating with people on a fairly deep level. But we need it. We need it desperately. And if we are truly on our own, how much more so do we need the gods in that moment? And particularly gods who can relate very intimately with what we've been going through. And it's not so much that the mythology tells us very much about how Modron reacted, or how the goddess Rhiannon reacted, or other goddesses whose children were taken from them or killed or who died. It's not that they go into the details of the grieving process those goddesses went through, or what they did to cope, or anything of that kind. But nevertheless, because they had those experiences, we know that if we reach out to them, we're going to have an ear that isn't just listening, but a mind that truly gets it and understands it on a deep, visceral level of the kind of pain and rage. Because losing a child, if you think that rage isn't going to be part of that grieving process, I don't know what to tell you. It's as if every single stage of the grieving process is just amplified. We're not really meant to outlive our own offspring. We're not meant to lose them. There's a reason why we don't handle this kind of thing particularly well. It's hard enough to lose family members when we know that they're older. They're 70, 80 years old, and their time comes. You certainly grieve that life. But at least in the case of that person, they actually got to live. They had time on earth. To have, whenever life is cut short, it just seems like the grief for that is just so much worse. But Modron gets it. Goddess Rhiannon gets it. Other goddesses do. Certainly gods who lost their children, even though they weren't the ones carrying them, they certainly understand what it's like to have that loss and to have to endure it. So when we find ourselves in this situation, no matter how it came about, probably the best thing we can do is to do a lot of pathworking meditations, devote a lot of time towards prayer, and not even asking them to take the pain away, because that's not how any of this works. Pain is not magicked away. We just learn how to endure it and then grow around it. We can certainly ask them for wisdom. We can ask them for guidance. We can ask them simply to listen. And I don't think we should dismiss the potential value of that, and how that can bring us about to what I think is the worst part of grief, but also an important part. And that is that moment of true acceptance, which is swiftly followed by the realization that not only is life in general going to go on, but your life is going to go on. And there's going to be a moment when you have to accept that you are allowed to be happy after this. You are allowed to have good experiences. You are allowed to have joy in life again. You're allowed to do all the things that the child you lost isn't going to be able to do. And for me, at least, I can't speak for others, but for me, that was the hardest part. And I wish that at the time that this happened, I wish I had been in the pagan community. I wish I had been Wiccan. I wish I had known that I could reach out to deities who genuinely understood my pain and who were going to support me through it. not to take the pain away, but simply to teach me how to deal and how to live again after the worst of the pain was over with. I think it was the loneliest part of my life because at that point, I wasn't even praying. I wasn't even praying to that, to the God that I claimed to believe in, claimed to worship, and claimed to do all these things for in His name. And I wasn't even talking to Him because at that moment, I just, if His one true religion was teaching that the life of my babies didn't count, then what would be the point of talking to Him? Why would I throw my burden onto that God when clearly it just didn't matter to Him? Or at least that was the impression I was given. I would hate it, just hate it, if someone who was pagan, a witch, Wiccan, found themselves feeling that way about our gods, to think that there was no one to whom they could turn. I realize not everyone works with the Celtic pantheon like I do. But whatever pantheon of gods that you find yourself drawn to, align with, or have been working with for some time, I would imagine there's going to be at least one individual amongst them who understands what it is to lose a child. So whoever that is, if you are needing that kind of support, I would urge you to reach out to that deity. They might be able to provide you with some strength that you wouldn't otherwise have, that can enable you to survive even when part of you doesn't really want to. If that's Modron, then that's wonderful. If it's a goddess in another pantheon, that's wonderful. But absolutely, when you're going through this kind of trial and you're at this kind of low point, don't hesitate to turn to these deities. They've existed for so much longer than we have. They've endured, had to evolve through so much more than we have. If anyone is going to understand and help us make some sense of it, it's them. So I think that's enough from me. If you've listened to this all the way through, especially if you've had to deal with anything like this in your life, well done. As you can see, it wasn't easy for me to discuss. I'm sure it wasn't necessarily easy for you to hear. Nevertheless, this is one of the reasons why religion and spirituality exists. It's to deal with the worst parts of our lives that we ever have to cope with. And it has to be talked about. Has to be dealt with. Has to be faced. I hope that this video plays a role in making it easier to face if you are bearing this particular burden. I hope it makes you feel less alone. And I hope it has brought to your mind that you do have resources at your disposal that are within your own worldview, and that it's not someone trying to provide you comfort from their point of view, but that there are other human beings and that there are gods who see things the way that you do, who can help you shoulder this burden that you bear. So, okay. That's it. I will see you in another video another time.